They say that I think last year, for example, the amount of money invested for investment purposes in silver was something estimated to be 179 million ounces for the whole year. And yet 225 million ounces trades in 1 hour, and I think that day we traded well over 500 million ounces. So, I mean, the numbers just don't make any sense in the real world. What purpose could there be other than to try to drive the price down? There could be no other purpose. Nobody in their right mind would sell silver down the $4 that it was sold down in such a short time period if they're trying to make a profit or trying to not incur as much loss, and nobody would have sold gold down by $100 in that very brief time over which that occurred.
Eric, could you see a date in the future sometime where on the opposite side of that trade, obviously if these entities are coming in and they're selling this quantity, almost a quarter percentage of the annual production of silver in a single hour, where on the receiving side, somebody would want to take delivery, where we're going to have some kind of disruptive event in the market where somebody's going to call these shorts on it and they won't be able to deliver. And if that's the case, then what will that say about the sanctity of our futures markets, where you want to go in and you want to think you want to take delivery on a position, but you can't get it because so many things have been sold short, they just can't honor it?
Well, most of us who look at the commodity markets just can't believe the volume. I mean, it bears no relationship to reality. And the fact is, Jim, somebody sold 6 billion of silver in an hour. I mean, nobody even produces that much. There's no single producer that produces that much in a year, let alone selling it in an hour. So I would say it's a joke of major proportions here. I intend to actually make a comment on that in my forthcoming Markets at a Glance, because anybody who could put one and one together would realize that what goes on in a commodity exchange does not represent what goes on in the real world. One, nobody has that amount of silver. It's almost shocking in a way, that there were buyers there for that. And to your point, if a few people get some resolve and decide to take delivery, of course, it would be impossible to deliver that amount of silver. So I think that over time, as people continue to buy silver, and I always find it interesting that if you look at U.S. Mint statistics, if you look at the statistics of the last two tranches of our silver trust, when I look at what we do at Sprott Money, people buy silver in a ratio to gold of 50 to 1 in physical volume. 50 to 1. The availability for investment purposes is something less than 6.5 to 1. They cannot keep buying at that level when there's that little silver available. And you probably are aware that even the people who caused this downturn, of course, last week covered a lot of their shorts. I mean, it's so obvious what's going on, and yet seemingly the authorities don't seem prepared to do anything about it. But given the passage of time, and knowing what's going on, and knowing the reasons to own gold and silver, and seeing what people do, I have no doubt that these physical buyers will, in time, overwhelm the paper sellers.
I wanted to focus in once again on monopolistic practices through this concentration of 2 or 3 short sellers, and especially when you are in the futures market where you start off to begin with, you're leveraged 10 to 1, but imagine if you had sizable amounts of capital. And, 30% of a market almost, I can see cases sometimes going before the courts in terms of monopolistic practices when one particular firm or entity controls that much of a market. They really move the market in terms of its price.
I definitely think it's possible, and I think it's been done in the past. Now, manipulation has a legal definition, and so while you and I may just be talking and saying that the price of this or that was certainly manipulated, that's not a lawyer speaking. That's, just an average person like talking with our neighbors. So when you get to the law, you actually have to show several things, including intent to manipulate, and you got to prove it in court. So if you're the government and I say, Jim, I think you manipulated the market, I've got to show, an email or a wiretap or, a handwritten note or something that showed that you intended to manipulate it. I also have to show that you had the concentration, the market power to do so. So if you had 30%, that is obviously enough. And then finally, I have to show that you were successful in that effort. So it's 3 pieces of a prong that you would have had to have proven in order to take an action, a prosecutorial action with regard to manipulation. Now, the Dodd-Frank law that passed in 2010 lessened the hurdle that we have to clear as part of government with regard to manipulation. But it's still tougher than I think it should be, and I'm hopeful that we are going to go after anybody and everybody who we believe has manipulated the market.
Dave, your response?
This one's a tough one because obviously he's correct as far as what is the legal definition. I think that the first point is the toughest one. I'm not certain that you would have to have an email or a wiretap or a note, as he expressed. It's possible. Certainly if you had any of those, it would be much, much beneficial to the case that the manipulation was, taking place. You'd have some hard evidence. I'm not sure that's totally required. It's pretty obvious the market's been moved around. I actually don't like the word manipulation, but of course that's what these lawsuits are about. Regardless, the market is moved around, and again, to prove it, that's where I really do have a tough time. I do not have a real strong legal background. I had contract law through my master's degree, and that was it. Studied that course pretty hard, by the way, but that doesn't make me any expert. So that is where I am a little bit concerned that even though most of us that have watched this market so carefully for so long know what's going on, to be able to prove it in a court of law and make it stick, I don't know, pretty tough. But yet I think that there's probably enough evidence over so many years by so many people for so long a period of time that there's probably enough there that they can make it stick.
Eric?
Yeah, Jim, my comments would be this. I mean, he's taking a very legalistic approach to the definition of manipulation. And, are there emails and this sort of thing? But the other two things that he suggested were, one, concentration, and two, success. And obviously, the concentration is so available to us. I mean, in the recent example, when we traded 225 million ounces in an hour, I mean, if we can't believe that that is massively excessive, and fine, go and tell me who put the orders in that wanted to sell it, or did you just trade it on your trading desk? That would be very easy to determine. And I'm sure a court of law, if they asked whomever it was that sold it, why did you need to sell 225 million ounces of silver that way? If you don't have a contract from people producing silver or some other bona fide reason to do it, we can only assume that you meant to push the price down. Of course, the other argument he made is success. Obviously, we've seen now many examples, but the two most blatant are the most recent, the Feb 29th leap year hit, and the Spring 11 hit when we're at 49.50, and in a 6-minute time span, the price, a 13-minute time span, the price of silver is down $6. Those tell you exactly what the success is, and this recent one, we already know they covered, I think the number was something like 40 million ounces subsequent to the Feb 29th smash. So obviously there's success there. We don't need to debate that whatsoever. And I would think in a court of law, if you ask 12 jurors, does it look like this person was overreaching his bounds of reasonableness? I would venture to say they would conclude that he was.
Dave, what about this issue? He's talking there about concentration of a few players, and of course you have to have the evidence that there's an intent. What about 2 weeks ago, where in a 10, 12-minute period, you had 45,000 contracts sold short in such a short period of time, where you had those 45,000 contracts representing 225 million ounces of silver, which it's my understanding there was only about a little over 30 million ounces of silver that were available for delivery. That, to me, stands out as a case of manipulation, and it would seem to be pretty clear-cut. Why would anybody sell that kind of amount of silver in such a concentrated effort of selling in such a short period of time? No person that I know that would be a legitimate buyer trying to impact the price would sell or buy in that manner.
I agree, and I have just a little bit to add on. When we did that interview that's on your website regarding how many contracts were actually sold on that day, and we referenced the 45,000 contracts, what I actually got from my broker was the actual number, and it's actually much larger. The actual number on that day was 110,000 contracts, and that represents 550 million ounces. 550 million ounces of silver. That is 3/4 of the world's annual production during one trading day, and most of it during a very short period of time during that trading day. Now think about that for a minute. If that doesn't by itself stand alone as a fact of manipulation, I don't know what would. Because if I were defending the case or presenting the case as the prosecutor and saying, look, there is manipulation, I would say that this is how markets work, and we've been through that too many times, and this is what was done. So markets move on concentration. This was total concentration. Anyone with half a brain knows it's going to move the market down, and the market did move down. What was the motive? Two motives, probably. One, to move the market down. That goes without question. Second motive, to profit from it. And we went over that on our previous interview. We talked about this. So for the record, I just want to update that. The reason I used the 225,000 number, Jim, was because that was on the Internet, and I didn't really want to contradict any of my friends until I had the actual number. And the number they derived was, pretty decent at the time. They were looking, I think, at an intraday chart, and that was a pretty good rounding number. But the actual number was basically 550 million ounces on paper. And as you say, Jim, that was backed by the total amount of 35 million ounces that is held by the dealers as in total. That's all 4 registered dealers with the CME, which is only 4 banks. Their total inventory combined is only 35 million. And yet we had 550 million ounces sold in one trading day. I don't know what else I can say, Jim. It's gone on far too long. I just think that this idea that they're going to kick this thing down the road and push out the position limits till June is just another situation that we are contending with through the whole financial system, pretending that this debt doesn't matter or we can correct it and continue to kick the can down the road, as the expression goes. CFTC is right in line with this. They're just delaying, stalling. They're not facing up to their responsibility as far as I'm concerned.
Something that has puzzled me, Eric, is, and this goes back to manipulation from a Ponzi scheme, but I want to go back to Bernie Madoff, where Harry Markopolos went to the SEC, to the Boston SEC in 2001, presented them the case on a silver platter, then went to the New York SEC, presented them with obvious manipulation. So as you just responded, you said, look, it's clear we've got concentration. 2 or 3 players that are doing this, and it was successful. It did bring the price of silver down. So have you been puzzled somewhat why the government is so slow to move against it? I mean, for the average person seeing this continuous thing, and let me add one more thing. Looking at a price of silver, silver has been on a 45-degree angle after the big takedown that we saw in April and May. And it seems to me, Eric, every time it gets close to 40, which is almost like a breakout, we got another slam down in September, and then we're back up moving towards that $40 mark, and we got that slam down. What is it about $40 silver they're afraid of?
Well, it's interesting, Jim. When I look back to Feb 29th, and I was sort of watching it almost to the minute at the time, and I would say everything was breaking out. Gold was breaking out, silver was breaking out. The mining indexes, the GDX and the GDXJ were all breaking out. And bang, right at 10 o'clock, they all failed. And am I surprised that this happens? No, I'm not at all surprised, because I believe, and I'm not the only person to believe this, is that there is a kind of managed retreat by the powers that be that don't want gold and silver to assume the role that they're going to assume, which is to be the reserve currency. And, we've already gone up 500 or 600% here in the price of gold in the last 12 years. But, it's been a very trying time for all of us, with all this massive volatility. No one's made it easy for anyone to own gold, particularly the weak hands, because you see these sudden sell-offs, and, you wonder why I'm invested in this. So, no, I'm not surprised that these things happen. I happen to be in a school where I think it's most likely, and I hope they prove in court, that it's been very orchestrated. And I think about the fact that it almost goes down every time a jobs number is reported, which it did this last week. And I think, well, why is it that day? And I sort of decided, well, the reason it's that day is because you need a time when everyone's focusing on a number, and everyone knows that's when we're going to do it. Because you don't have other times when necessarily there's a data point that, could be misinterpreted, or basically the firing gun, if you will. Okay, this is when we're going to knock it down. So I'm not surprised at all to see what goes on, and it's disgusting in a lot of ways. I personally believe that when they have a trial on manipulation, there is likely to be ample evidence that that is the case.